Hey, Harbor family, really good to see you. Hope you had a great week. And my voice is a little crackly. That tells you how great of a week I had. We had a whole lot of church leaders from across Hawaii here on Wednesday morning. We were gathering just to dream about what God might do in our churches and through our churches to expand his kingdom across these islands. And it was just a fantastic time, strategizing together, praying together, thinking together. We had a guest speaker who asked a question that I hadn't really thought about. Here's what he said. No matter who you voted for in this last election, the reality is that things are going to be a little easier for churches for the next 4 years. So I don't care who you voted for. The reality is that the policies that are coming in are going to make things a little bit easier for churches. So his question was this: how are you preparing for that? Because that's never guaranteed. We're not owed that. But for the next 4 years, we might have things a little easier. So what are you going to do with that short amount of time that we've got? That was a question that just stuck with me this week. I was thinking about that for our church, thinking about that for my own life. What are we going to do with a short amount of time that we've got? I don't know what you would say to that question. Like, if you knew that you only had a short amount of time left on this earth, what would you do with that time? Maybe try and check some things off your bucket list, like go hike the Great Wall of China, or go surf Te Ahupo'o. Maybe you want to go skydiving. Maybe you want to dye your hair green. I don't know what you want to do with the short amount of time that you would have left on this earth. But here's the reality. That time is short. Peter, the Apostle Peter, he thought about that question a lot. Because apostles always knew their time was short. Apostles were always getting executed left and right. It was just kind of, it came with a job description, and they knew it. And so they were always thinking, what am I going to do with this short amount of time that I have on this earth? He thought about that for his own life, but he also thought about that for all of our lives. Time is short for all of us. And so look at what Peter said in 1 Peter 4. The end of all things is near. Therefore, number one, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. And then number two, maintain constant love for one another. You know what he's saying there? He's saying you've only got two priorities. Love God, love one another. That's your two priorities. Because time is short. The end of all things is near. And I know we like to talk about the end times, especially during election years. That's when we start thinking, yeah, the end might be near. But the reality is, the end has been near for the last 2,000 years. That's when Peter wrote this, 2,000 years ago. And he said it's near. You know why he said that? Because out of all of God's plan of salvation, there's only one event left in his plan. He's fulfilled every other thing on his agenda except to send his son back, to send Jesus to return. That's the only thing left for God to do, and that could happen at any time. So there's only two priorities we got until that happens. There's really only two things on our bucket list. Love God, love others. That's it. And in 1 Peter 4, Peter wants to show us what that kind of love is going to look like. So if you got your Bible, open to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter 4. If you don't have a Bible, there's hardback Bibles around you. Grab one of those, turn to page 1077 in those hardback Bibles. 1077. If you don't have a Bible at home, feel free to grab that Bible, take it home. That's our gift to you. We'd love for you to have it. In chapter 3, last week, Peter was talking about the love of God that led him to die for us. And so now he's going to ask us the question, what does it look like for us to love God in return? What does it look like for us to love one another? Let's see what he says in 1 Peter 4. We're going to start right at the beginning, verse 1. Peter says, therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, highlight that right there, because that changes everything. That's the foundation for everything. Since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin. Everything starts with the suffering and the death of Jesus. Like it says in 1 John 4, this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. That he sent his son to be an atoning sacrifice for us. That's what love is. That's what love is defined by. That's where love starts. So you want to know how to love God? That's where you start. Number one, appreciate his sacrifice. That's the very definition of love. That's where you see love most powerfully in all of human history. Because his sacrifice at the cross, that changes everything. The cross gives you everything you are looking for in life. Everything. You want to know what Jesus did for you on the cross? Just listen to what Jesus said on the cross. I know maybe you're looking for forgiveness. Well, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The cross gives you mercy and grace. Maybe you're looking for hope. You're just feeling kind of despondent in life. Well, Jesus said, truly, I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise. He said that to the thief right next to him. The cross gives you hope for the future that you won't find anywhere else. Maybe you're looking for community. Well, on the cross, Jesus looked at his mother, Mary. He looked at his disciple, John, and he said, behold, woman, your son. Behold, your mother. They weren't related to each other, but the cross brings a new family together that we've never had before. Maybe you're looking for victory. You're just feeling defeated lately, deflated lately. Well, Jesus said on the cross, it's finished. The battle is won. The cross gives you victory in life, victory over your sin. All your sin was crucified with Christ. And that's what Peter's thinking about right here. He says, the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin. And then verse 2, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. Jesus suffered in the flesh, and so he was finished with sin, just done. He conquered it, he's done with sin. And so now Peter expects us to live the same way, to just be finished with sin. Just be done with it. Like, all right, I'm done with you. I'm just done with you, sin. To stop living for our own desires and start living for God's will. Because that's another big way we can love God. Number 2, pursue his will. Pursue his desires instead of our own human desires. Our natural desires never quite match up to God's desires. Never completely. And Peter's going, hey, you've spent plenty of time just pursuing your own desires. Spent plenty of time doing that. Look at verse 3. There's already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on in unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and lawless idolatry. Peter's going, yeah, you spent plenty of time doing all that. And we could do a deep dive, go word by word into that laundry list he just gave us, figure out what all of that is. But when it boils down to it, here's what all of that has in common. It's all about our appetites. Everything in that list is all about our appetites and giving in to our appetites. Just going wherever your desires, especially your physical desires, lead you. Especially with things that aren't even that bad, that aren't inherently bad. Like alcohol isn't inherently bad. It becomes bad when we give in to our appetites. When we give into that third drink, fourth drink, fifth drink. Sex isn't inherently bad. It becomes bad when we give into our appetites, when we take the fire out of the fireplace that God designed it to stay in within marriage. When we give in to that website that's always just sitting there waiting for us. When we give in to that flirty girl or that really thoughtful guy that's always waiting for you. There's a theme that I hear when I talk to Christians who've fallen into sin. The theme is this: it seems to happen when they're in a time of suffering or when they're coming out of a time of suffering. That's when it really strikes a lot of times. Because when life is hard, it's tempting to feel like that gives you an excuse to give in to your appetites. A few years ago, there was a pastor in Connecticut who was arrested because he stole $1.3 million from his church. $1.3 million. And it wasn't a big church. It's an average-sized church. He stole $1.3 million from it. And when they arrested him, asked him why he did it, here's what he said: the church treated me really bad. I deserved it. That's what he said. When life is hard, we feel like we deserve to give in to our appetites. There's husbands who feel like they're not getting the intimacy they deserve from their wives, and so they deserve to go on the internet. Go somewhere else and find it. There's wives who feel like they're not getting the appreciation they deserve from their husbands. And so they deserve to go buy a really expensive pair of shoes, right? That solves everything right there. For you young wives, let me give you a pro tip on how to do this really well. Let me give you a guide to this. Buy those really expensive shoes, hide them somewhere in the closet for 6 months, and then when you bring them out and wear them for the first time and your husband's like, are those new? You can be like, no, I've had these forever. I've had these a long time. That's how you get away with it, okay? That's how you give in to your appetites. But Peter says, no, enough with all of that. Enough. You spent enough time doing all that. Enough time pursuing your own appetites, because there's really only 2 ways of life in this world. Only 2 ways of life, pursuing God's will or pursuing your own will. That's the only 2 options you got. And they're eons, miles, light years apart. Pursuing God's will or pursuing your own will. I know as Christians, I know how you operate, okay? I know we always try and find the line between those 2. We try and find the line where godliness becomes worldliness, where holiness becomes sinfulness. We try and find that line because we want to try and dance as close to that line as possible. And Peter says, no, enough with that. You spent enough time doing that. Don't say, how far can I run towards worldliness before it becomes sin? Say to yourself, how far away from worldliness can I run towards holiness? How fast can I run towards Jesus? That's the question to ask. That's what it looks like to love God. Here's the problem. When you do that, the world's not going to like it. Look at what Peter says in verse 4. He says they're surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of wild living. And so they slander you. You don't join them in their living, and so they slander you. You high schoolers, you college kids, you know that really well. You see what the kids around you are doing, and it's hard not to join them in the same flood of wild living. Here's the bad news for you. It doesn't get any easier when you get older. It doesn't get any easier. It's hard not to join the office gossip. It's hard not to join the crude jokes on the job site. It's hard not to join the bottomless mimosa brunch or the 6-pack per person pauhana with the guys after work. It's hard not to join that. But if you do, if you refuse to join, you'll get mocked, like Peter says. You get slandered, ridiculed. Because people don't want to be around people who aren't as dedicated as they are to their own pleasure. Nobody wants to be around that. We're the same. If you go to Disneyland, you don't want to see somebody with a sign protesting the war in Gaza, right? Listing how many innocent people have died. You don't want to see that. You might even be against the war in Gaza. You're definitely against innocent people dying. We're all against that, right? But you don't want to think about that when you're on It's a Small World. You just don't want to think about that. That's how the world operates. We don't want to be around people who aren't as dedicated as we are in the moment to our own pleasure. And so Peter says, they'll slander you. They'll mistreat you. You just got to expect it to happen. A few years ago, my parents went to dinner for their anniversary at a really nice place right on the ocean. They got seated at the prime table right on the water, best view. Their meals came out, and they prayed over their dinner just like they do for every meal. And then a couple minutes later, the manager came over, and he said, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to reseat you at a table in the back. Because they didn't want blatant displays of religion at this restaurant. The people around them were just enjoying a meal. They didn't want to be confronted with that. We can get outraged about stuff like that, but Peter says, just expect it. Just expect it to happen. And trust God to deal with it when it happens. Trust God to deal with it. Look at what he says in verse 5. They'll give an account. You don't have to worry about justice. You don't have to worry about outrage, standing up for yourself. They'll give an account to the one who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel is also preached to those who are now dead, so that although they might be judged in the flesh according to human standards, they might live in the spirit according to God's standard. What is he saying? God is the judge, not you. That's what he's saying. When you're slandered and mistreated, it's natural for us to want to get even, try and make them suffer the same way, stand up for ourselves, at least get in the last word, prove that you still have the upper hand. But Peter says, you can just let it go. Because you know that God stands ready to judge the living and the dead. And that word ready, that means it could happen at any moment. So that's why Peter says in verse 7, the end of all things is near. The end of all things is near. There's no more events in God's plan of salvation before Jesus returns. He could come back at any time. The end of all things is near. And so therefore, Peter says, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. So here's one more way to love God. Number 3, seek his presence. Seek his presence in prayer. And according to Peter, that's going to take some hard work. I know we feel like we want to just kind of drift into prayer. We just want to just chill with God and call that prayer. I know, I feel that sometimes. But prayer doesn't happen when you just paddle out and just try and feel God around you in the ocean. Prayer doesn't happen when you go on a hike and just try and sense God's presence in nature around you. Peter says we got to be alert and sober-minded if we're going to be in prayer. It requires some work. You remember how Jesus prayed in the garden the night before he was crucified? Family, he was sweating blood. That's how hard he was praying. He was praying for himself, praying for the people that he loved, praying for the world that he was about to die for. That's the kind of passion it takes to be in prayer. That's why I don't call prayer time quiet time. I know that's a phrase we use in the Christian world, quiet time. No, prayer isn't supposed to be like that. Look what Tim Chester said. Biblical spirituality is not a spirituality of silence. It is a spirituality of passionate petition. If we are engaged with the world around us, we'll be passionate about people's needs, our holiness, and God's glory. We'll not be still in prayer. We'll cry out for mercy with a holy violence. Yeah, because that's how Jesus prayed. Sweating blood. Do you remember how Peter prayed? Remember what Peter was doing when Jesus was sweating blood? Peter was sleeping. Jesus asked him, stay awake and pray with me, and Peter just went straight to sleep. That's why he says here, you got to be alert. You got to be sober-minded for prayer. He learned that the hard way. He learned that the hard way in the garden. He learned that it is hard work to seek the presence of God. It's hard work to be dependent on God. It's a lot easier just to wing it on your own and just go to sleep. You got to be alert and sober-minded to love God. And when you do, then he'll empower you to love the people around you. Peter says, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. And then verse 8, above all, maintain constant love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sins. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, and that love is defined as covering over their sins. And you're like, okay, that's interesting. What does that mean? What does it mean to cover over a multitude of sins? Like if you love me, you'll cover up my sin? Is that what that means? Does it mean that if you love me, you'll endorse my sin? You'll just accept me for whoever I decide to be? No. Covering sin means forgiving sin. Because that's what's involved in love. Peter's shown us how to love others, and here's number 1, forgive them. A lot of times that's the first and hardest step to loving somebody. Forgive them. That's the first thing you can do to love them. When people sin, we usually respond in one of 2 ways. Either we ignore it or we retaliate against it. Those are the 2 responses we've usually got. Either we pretend like it didn't happen or we pretend like it's the worst thing that ever happened and we got to do something about it. Well, Peter says you don't have to ignore it or retaliate against it. You can address it and then forgive it. Because that's what love looks like. In 1 Corinthians 13, it says, if you love, you'll be patient and kind, even with people who are impatient and unkind. It says, if you love, you won't envy or boast, even when everybody else at work is envying, talking stink about that guy who got the promotion who shouldn't have got that promotion. It says, if you love, you won't be arrogant or rude, even when everybody else in your family is passively, aggressively maneuvering to get what they want. It says you won't insist on your own way. You're not going to demand things in your marriage, even if you probably won't get those things. You won't be irritable or resentful. You won't get annoyed all the time at the things your kids do. It says you'll bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, endure all things. Even when life seems unbearable, even when people are unbelievable. Because that's what love looks like. That's what it looks like to cover over a multitude of sins. If you don't have love, you'll always be suspicious about what people say. You'll always think the worst of what other people do. You'll always be annoyed at how other people live. Especially when those people are different from you. And that's what Peter has in mind in verse 9. Look at what he says in verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Be hospitable. I know when we hear that word, we have something in our minds. Here's the thing. Being hospitable is not the same as showing off your mad cooking skills when you invite your friends over for dinner. That's not what hospitality in the Bible is. Being hospitable towards people is different from entertaining people. Those are two different things. Entertaining, that can be all about me. Showing me off, my skills off. Hospitality is all about others. It's about welcoming others, blessing others, especially others who are different from me. Because that word that Peter uses for hospitality is the Greek word philoxenos, which literally means love of the stranger. Peter says, welcome those people. And so here's one more way to love others. Number 2, welcome them. Especially thems who are different. People who are totally different from you. I know it's hard to do. It's a lot easier to love people who are like you, people who like the same music, like the same sports, people who like the same shows and books and movies, people who talk like you, look like you, dress like you, people who went to the same high school, people you got history with. It's a lot harder to love people who are different. But that's what Christ-like love looks like. The world loves people who are just like them. But we're called to be different. Christ-like love means welcoming people who are radically different, welcoming them in, inviting them in, making them feel at home, whether that's your literal home or your community group or your ministry team or your friend group. This kind of instruction, this was revolutionary when Peter was writing, because he was writing to some very socially stratified people, very status-conscious people. That's what the Roman world of the first century was all about. Figuring out what level you are at and how to climb to the next level and never even acknowledge the people who are at a lower level. Rich people would never find themselves with poor people. It just never happened, particularly at dinner time. That's when the social stratification was most obvious in the first century world. And so that's why Jesus was always getting slammed for eating with people. Have you ever noticed when you've read the Gospels that the things that they always complained about was who Jesus ate with? You ever notice that? He eats with tax collectors. He eats with sinners. He had a drink. He shared a drink with a Samaritan woman. Can you believe that? Yeah. Jesus was modeling philoxenos. Philoxenos, not pursuing relationships for what you can get from people, pursuing relationships so you can welcome people. People who can't raise your social standing. People who might actually lower your social standing if other people see you with them. Peter says, embrace those people. Eat with those people. welcome them. And then number 3, serve them. That's how you love them. You look for ways to use what God's given you to be a blessing to them. Look at what Peter says in verse 10. Verse 10, just as each one has received a gift, use it to serve others as good stewards of the varied grace of God. You are a steward of God's grace. In other words, a manager of God's grace. Let me ask you, how much of God's grace is there? How much grace does God have? Man, it is limitless. Ephesians says there's the riches, limitless riches of God's grace. And you've been made a manager of it. Because as Peter says, you've been given a gift out of God's grace. A grace gift. And he says each gift is varied. Each one of our grace gifts is different. So you could have a grace gift of certain abilities. Or your gift could be just time and energy and a really flexible schedule. That's a great gift to have. You could have gifts of money and resources, or you could have a grace gift of a really great spouse and a really healthy, warm family. What a wonderful gift to have. It could be anything that God's given you. Maybe you're like, well, I don't know what my grace gift is. I don't know what my spiritual gifts are. It's really easy to find out. Just start trying stuff. Start serving people and see what happens. Try being hospitable. See what happens. Try being generous. See what happens. Try teaching some people what God has shown you in his word. Try leading some people who are younger in the faith than you and just see what happens. When you find something that you feel like you're good at, that's probably your spiritual gift. That's your grace gift. And whatever your grace gift is, there's one purpose for it. What does Peter say? As each one has received a gift, use it to serve. And not to serve yourself. If God gave you skills, don't use them to serve your own ego, your own pride. If God gave you money, don't use it to serve your own desires. As each one has received a gift, use it to serve others. Because that's what love looks like. Serving others rather than yourself. That's really hard to do, especially on an ongoing basis. You can do it for a couple hours on a Saturday morning at a work day. You can do it once a month, volunteering for some ministry team. That's doable. It's harder to do every single day and all the time in every relationship. That is going to require the grace and strength of God to make that happen. And so look at what Peter says in verse 11. If anyone speaks, let it be as one who speaks God's words. You're going to need God to empower your speech. If anyone serves, let it be from the strength that God provides. You're going to need God to empower your service so that God may be glorified through Jesus Christ in everything. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. God will give you the strength and the words and the wisdom to do everything he's calling you to do so that you can bring glory to him. He'll give you everything you need to love him and to love the people around you. And he'll show you that he'll do that by reminding you that he gave you himself. You can love him and love the people around you because he loved you first. Here's the only problem. Here's the reason why we don't get there. It's because too many of us receive God's love and just hoard God's love. We receive it, we ingest it, we enjoy it, and we do nothing with it. There's a word for that. You know what that word is when you ingest and don't divest? Constipation is what that's called. Spiritual constipation is what we're talking about. Ingesting God's love and just letting it sit and rot inside of you. It is a disgusting thought, but that is a disgusting thing. Just to receive God's love and do nothing with it, man, that'll mess you up. I talk to Christians all the time who feel like they've hit this plateau in their faith. Like there used to be joy and passion and love and excitement, but now they just feel dead. 15 years ago, I was talking to a guy like that. He called me up, wanted to have lunch. So we went out to lunch, and he was living on the North Shore, living in this beachfront house that he did a couple hours a day of handyman work in exchange for free rent, him and his wife. And when we met for lunch, he was like, Matt, I just feel like my faith is dead. There's just nothing going on. I just don't want to pray. I don't want to get into God's word. I don't know what's going on. I'm like, well, tell me about your average day. What's your average day look like? He's like, well, I wake up and I surf, and then I work for a couple hours, and then I surf again, and then I eat lunch, and then I go dive, and then I eat dinner, and then I watch a movie with my wife and my dog, and we go to sleep. That's my average day. I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty nice. Sounds like you've got life really well figured out. Nice, comfortable life. Let me ask you, what do you even need God for? Doesn't seem like you need God for anything in your life. I knew him really well, so I could talk to him like that. Well, what do you need God for in your life? He's like, yeah, I guess I don't really need him for anything. I was like, yeah, there's no need for you to pray. There's no reason for you to go to his word. There's no reason for you to seek God for anything when you've got life dialed in on your own. And he just kept looking down. But a year later, everything had changed. Everything. He and his wife had started going down to Waikiki on Saturday nights with a group of folks from Harbor, rescuing victims of the sex trafficking industry. And he was forced to spend 2 or 3 hours every weekend in prayer, just begging God for protection because the pimps were not happy that they were there. Taking away a money stream from them, an income stream. He was praying all the time. A year after that, he felt God lead him to plant a church in one of the areas of the island that's just ridden with poverty and drugs and crime. And some of you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Pastor John at Harbor North Shore, who planted in one of the worst parts of Wailua there on the North Shore. And since then, everything about his life has changed. Everything has been transformed because he leaned forward into loving God and loving others. He leaned forward into that, and so that changed everything. His faith is alive. It's completely different. So what about us, family? Time is short. Time is really short. It's fine if you want to go skydive, go hike the Great Wall of China, fine to have a bucket list, but you want to know what's going to bring real fulfillment in the short amount of time we've got? You want to know what's going to make you feel alive? Leaning forward. Leaning forward into loving God and loving the people around you. That is what's going to bring you life. Let's pray together. Oh, Lord, we need you so desperately. So I want to ask everybody in this room, even those of you watching online, I want to ask you to stretch out your hand in front of you with your palm up, just to receive God's love right now. We desperately need your love every moment of our lives, Lord. And I want to pray particularly for the people in this room, the people watching online, who feel dead in their faith right now. I know there's some of them sitting right here, right now. I pray specifically for them, that you would give them a powerful experience of your love right in this moment. I know maybe right now they don't feel your love. They don't feel like you're with them. They don't feel like you're blessing them. Help them to have a radical new experience of your love as you remind them that you've already given them the greatest blessing in the universe. when you sent your son to die for them. Awaken them, Lord. Revive them. Take their dead bones, bring them to life. Maybe for the first time, Lord. Awaken all of us to your love so that we can imitate your love, so that we can respond to your love through worship and praise, through our holiness, through our love for the world around us. We would be nothing without the love of Jesus. So help us to rest in his love. Help us to be enlivened by his love. Help us to be transformed, renewed, and filled and empowered to minister to this lost and dying world through that love. It's by the love of Jesus we pray.